we have times of kind of trade instability, nations start maybe looking more at their self-sufficiency. They're looking at stable sources of supply. So I think what we're probably going to see is kind of a greater focus on what can be sourced from native supply. So there is certainly an opportunity amidst all of this confusion, this disruption, for more locally sourced product.
Over the past few weeks, you may have been listening to news reports from the United States and watching with a mixture of fascination, dread, or even horror at how the Trump administration is using tariffs as a tool in global trade policy. Outside of the administration, it's hard to find a reputable economist or financial expert who supports tariffs as a way to boost world trade or global prosperity. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. While most of the discussion in the Irish media around tariffs focus on pharmaceuticals, butter, or the potential impact on the digital services sector, the broader farming sector could be more exposed. I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Michael Wallace from UCD to explore the implications of these on-again, off-again tariffs and what they could mean for Irish farming, in particular Irish tillage farms. Michael, you might just give us a bit of an overview of the existing tariffs that were imposed on US grain coming into Europe.
The European Union applies a structured and protective tariff system on agricultural imports, including US grain and other farm products. I mean, that works through what is known as the common external tariff under World Trade Organization rules. So the EU has a common external tariff rates that it sets across various product categories. And then most favored nation tariff rates would apply to nations that don't have a free trade agreement with the EU, and that would include the United States. So in the case of the kind of European Union sort of tariff structure, I suppose the big focus around its protections are really related to the livestock sector. So particularly for products like beef and lamb, obviously dairy products, but much lower levels of protection for tillage products. So, for example, imports of soybeans basically coming in at zero tariff rates. In the case of cereals, generally very, very low rates because there are high, what are known as tariff rate quotas. So a lot of product can come in at zero rate. Even though the EU has, for example, a tariff level of 95 euro per ton on wheat, because of the significant tariff rate quotas that apply, it imports basically everything at pretty much at zero tariff rate like that.
Okay, so from a grain point of view, it's kind of zero tariffs, as you're saying.
Very low protection for grain.
But I suppose the Trump administration, and I know it's a difficult question because they're on again, off again, I suppose, really. But in terms of the initial tariffs that were announced, there's a 10%, I think, across the board, which I think is maybe still there, I think. But there was probably other ones coming through. And how are they? Or what were they proposed ones, I suppose, really, before we get rid of them, because they might come back again if you like.
Yeah, it's quite a complex picture because there's been so many different announcements. I just saw a meme where that President Trump dressed up as the Karate Kid with tax on, tax off. It's kind of almost hard to follow what sometimes with the rate of announcements that are coming forward. But I suppose let's kind of try and work through it really from the so-called Liberation Day announcements that came through on April 2nd. Effectively, Trump made the argument that he wanted to impose Tariffs basically on all imports into the United States, really around promoting domestic manufacturing in the US, but also around certain national security concerns and also addressing trade deficits, which is a big issue for the Trump administration. They're particularly had focused in on sort of the technology sectors, automotive industry, energy systems like solar panels and indeed metals were the other area. But what they essentially, I suppose, what you see really with agriculture has essentially got caught up in really the crossfire, given that the emphasis in the targeted sectors really was really outside agriculture. That said, what really was announced then on that April 2nd was the introduction of a universal 10% tariff on all imported goods, with just a very few exceptions, mainly related to energy products and certain critical minerals. And then on top of that 10%, they announced this kind of idea of a reciprocal tariff, which was a kind of a bizarre kind of calculation. Essentially, the reciprocal tariff rate is calculated based on the level of the sort of trade balance between the US and the other nation, and where basically the US runs a trade deficit, then higher tariff was basically applied to those countries based on some sort of simple ratio of the size of that trade deficit to the country's overall imports and from the United States. So kind of a rather simplistic approach, but it obviously resulted in higher tariffs then being proposed, which would include an additional 10% being applied to the EU, bringing them up to a tariff rate of 20% on European Union goods coming into the US, and of course, as we know, much higher for some other nations. And then, of course, the tit for tat kind of, I suppose, conflict really with China really resulted in that again quickly elevating up to China now with a tariff rate of 145%. For imports coming in from China into the US. And of course, China likewise having increased its tariffs up to 125% on American goods going into their market. Trump then subsequently announced the suspension of at least part of those reciprocal tariffs, so the higher rate, particularly for most nations apart from China and Canada and Mexico. So that has been scrapped. So it's just the universal 10% tariff that is being applied for the next 90 days, and then they're proposing to come back to look at this again. So quite a complex piece. Alongside that, of course, introducing exemptions for certain products, particularly in the smartphones and indeed pharmaceuticals as well.
Just to clarify, Michael, is the ones on, I think the tariffs on the metals, they were kind of there further, they were the first ones out the gap, or kind of thing, weren't they?
That's correct.
And is it tariffs are those tariffs still there? Have they been suspended, or are they still there? Because, and just to finish out that question when you're answering it, wasn't there reciprocal tariffs from the EU based around that initial one?
That's correct on the metal tariffs. Now, I believe those are still in place. So those tariffs have been kind of continued. But the other elements, the other part of the sort of reciprocal tariff has been suspended for 90 days. Yeah,
okay.
It is a very complex picture when you look at across different product areas with some exemptions, as we've noted.
So there was an EU proposal, from what I can understand, in the confusion of the fog that's out there. There was an EU proposal for a reciprocal tariff in response to the metals. On the one that caught my eye was around corn. That was supposed to come in, I think, yesterday or the day before, I think, but that has been suspended now, was it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a plan. The EU had indicated that it would respond with reciprocal tariffs across a range of products, but I suppose from our point of view, particularly thinking in the imports coming into the EU of American grains and soya would be kind of the ones that could be most exposed. And as you mentioned, particularly with the maize being caught in sort of in the crossfire there, with the EU looking to impose reciprocal tariffs that would apply there. But as of yet, that has been held off.
Okay. One of the other ones, Michael, that were certainly, I know we were talking to the drinks industry, they were extremely concerned about the imposition of tariffs going into the United States because it's a very big market for them. That could, if it was reciprocal kind of bits and pieces there, could end up in 200% tariffs, I think was mentioned in some of the discussions that Trump are having. I don't think it's quite as bad as that, is it?
No. So as things stand, Irish whiskey is facing a 10% tariff going into the American market. So it's just that universal tariff rate that's being applied. It could have been facing the 20% rate, and then if the argument I suppose that Trump was making is that the EU responded, then that would escalate the tariffs that he would then apply to European goods. So there was talk about wine and cheese and whiskey being caught up in that element of this conflict.
In the last tariffs that Trump kind of brought in, there were reciprocal tariffs through Europe, of which they did target the likes of bourbon and Harley Davidsons and bits and pieces like that. You might explain to us why the EU took that approach, and or maybe why the EU has taken such a targeted approach to some of these reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens when it comes to retaliatory tariffs is that countries are looking to exert maximum effect while trying to at least minimize their damage on their own economy. I guess in the case of the case of those European retaliatory tariffs, which really, I suppose, emerged from the sort of Airbus Boeing debacle back in the first Trump presidency. There was a kind of initially the US imposed 25% tariffs on an array of European goods, and as you probably recall, one of the products that got caught up in that was single malt whiskey. The EU likewise then responded with significant tariffs then that they imposed on bourbon and a number of other products alongside that in retaliation. It was an expensive episode for both sides.
If we look at the overall, let's just say a tariffs came in around the grain scenario. American grain then became extremely expensive from the point of view of exporting grain. It's already too expensive, I would imagine, to be sold into China anymore, given the tariffs that are there. What happens? What happens? Is it the American farmer that's going to suffer completely? Will they try and dump cheap grain somewhere else? Will the rest of the grain around the world rise in price? What's the macroeconomic sense of what happens out there if this all goes a bit pear-shaped?
Yeah, I mean, what essentially we're looking at there is the likely trade diversion effects that would arise when tariffs are imposed. So I suppose the most obvious one would be US exports, particularly of soybeans to China. China is obviously a huge market for United States agriculture, and soybeans is probably one of the big exports there. Essentially with the level of tariffs that are now in place on those imports to China, it basically makes the American product prohibitively expensive. So what is likely to happen then is that China will then seek to source from other countries, particularly Brazil. So we expect that will put pressure on supplies, particularly from Brazil, as China seeks to source more product from there. And also, of course, because the US product that would have been exported to China is now trying to find another home, that then becomes then potentially a very aggressively priced in other markets where it is facing lower rates of tariffs. Now, I suppose a lot depends on the extent to which the EU would be responding with higher tariffs to protect against that. But in the absence of that just the tariffs that have been imposed by China will cause trade diversion, and we're likely to see ripple effects, the knock-on effects of that in other markets. including into EU, that will impact on Irish grain prices.
And so I suppose the bit that I'm kind of still a little bit struggling with is that there's only a defined amount of grain in the world, and it's the supply and demand of it is fairly well finely balanced one year
Hmm.
with the next. And you really only get a kind of an overall price reduction if there's a shortage of grain worldwide, or an increase if there's not enough of it out there. But in the same regard, we still have the same amount of grain, even though there's trade tariffs there. I'm still not quite clear that how, if American soya is now they have to try and dump it somewhere to a degree, or try and be more aggressive, as you rightly say out there. Does that really mean that, the price in Brazil, for instance, which we're going to go, as you say, are going to go to Canada, or going to go to China, they're going to charge more for it? Does that not rise all boats somewhere or other?
Well, certainly as China seeks to source its protein elsewhere, as it seeks to source soybeans from, particularly from Brazil, and indeed other South American countries, I suppose, would be kind of the dominant sort of parties there that could actually meet their requirements. What we're already seeing is that elevating prices in Brazil for soybeans that really is already starting to take effect. So it's certainly pushing that up. So essentially, the tariff is creating a wedge there. I mean, if you think about what the tariffs are doing, they're blocking or making American soybeans in this case, more expensive on certain markets, and that loss of that market basically is suppressing price of soybeans, certainly in the United States, and alongside that, they are likely to have to look for other markets that they can then sell those soybeans on. So it can have asymmetrical effects when you think about across different countries, some being exposed to greater price shocks than others, particularly depending on what side of that trade relationship you're sitting.
And do you think then that, I suppose, in the round, and I know we are, I suppose, an overall importer, but to a degree, the Irish tillage farmer takes the world grain price nonetheless. Do you think there might be an opportunity there for the Irish tillage farmer in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly opportunities there. I mean, we've been just, I suppose, talking a lot about protein crops, particularly, and Ireland obviously imports a lot of animal feed. And in fact, we probably import something around 90% or more of our protein requirement. Um, so there is certainly an opportunity amidst all of this confusion, this disruption, for more locally sourced product to be utilized, and the stability that comes from being able to source more locally. So I think that is perhaps one of the sort of key opportunities that are there to actually provide, I suppose, when we have times of kind of trade instability, nations start maybe looking more at their self-sufficiency. They're looking at stable sources of supply. So I think what we're probably going to see is kind of a greater focus on what can be sourced from native supply, and of course then going out from that probably within the EU type supply chains as well. So I think there certainly will be opportunities in that situation, and we might also see increased demand, as the EU looks to I suppose replace some of the product. If there are tariffs that they're imposed on, for example, American grain, then they will have to source that somewhere else, and that could start to see a lift in prices for Irish tillage farmers, just because of the interconnected nature of all of those markets. So depending on how the EU responds and to what extent they actually try to protect the EU market with tariffs, those tariffs would have an elevating effect on prices for Irish tillage farmers. So that would be obviously a potential opportunity in this situation, and would be I suppose the example of that.
Probably on the other side of it, probably comes at a bit of an opportune time, given the fact that the EU are now discussing the next round of CAP in terms of their, I think it's, certainly the new commission is talking more about competitiveness, but they're also developing the new CAP. How do you think that should feed into thinking within the EU, maybe not just in Ireland in general, but within the EU?
Yeah, I think there are important implications here from a policy point of view. And I suppose when we think about the cap, one of the elements is around, how we future-proof those agri supports. And I suppose a concern that I would have here is that given the pressure that's likely to come on American producers and their important voter body for the Republican Party, we're probably likely to see increased levels of compensatory support going to tillage farmers in the United States to offset the impacts they're getting hit with these retaliatory tariffs. So I think the EU has to be responsive to that, because there are clear risks if American farmers end up getting compensated for that hit that they're taking to prices because of the tariffs, and then they can keep on producing. That product is going to have to be disposed elsewhere, and it will have ramifications elsewhere in the world, including within the EU and in Ireland. So we need responsive agri supports. We also need to look at aspects of around, how we kind of shore up our own markets and defend our agri-food exports, because, as we mentioned already, we're seeing agriculture getting caught up in the crosshairs, really, of a dispute that is largely related to other sectors. And I think what we've seen, I suppose, with some of the diplomacy that's been ongoing, I think that's been welcome, is saying, right, maybe we should just hold off before just jumping into retaliation, because when you retaliate, as you were mentioning earlier, let's say we take the bourbon side, EU puts a big tariff on bourbon, the US then responds and puts a big tariff on whiskey, and those exports are hammered then. So we need to be very, very careful here, just to, the type of reactions that we engage in, that there is suitable levels of consideration to any retaliatory responses and the knock-on consequences of that, so we're actually protecting our own markets. Also, I suppose, around things like opportunities to diversify markets, and that includes both in terms of looking at how we reduce dependency maybe on higher risk regions, and what needs to be done there to ensure, stability. And I suppose that's particularly for imports of feed grains for livestock farmers, I suppose, is particularly important in the EU. And I suppose how we nationally look at our own crop diversification and market diversification. How can we get more value added type products? How do we extract more from maybe some of the niche areas, some of the premiums? How do we boost maybe protein crop production? Obviously, that's been an important part of national policy over recent years, and I would hope that would continue. How we boost aspects of our sustainability and those credentials becoming important in terms of protecting and future-proofing the industry. So there are kind of lots of things that policymakers, I think, can do to actually build up and enhance the resilience of the tillage sector, including even down to things like how we support innovation and technology transfer. I mean, the industry faces a need to continue to improve its processes, to adopt new technology, particularly in the precision agriculture side, adopting new financial tools as well, because we need to get better at managing risk and using the available financial tools like the profit monitor and other financial tools that can help farmers better assess their situation and indeed manage risks like the trade ones that we've been talking about more effectively.
Michael, you've done a great job in terms of turning the fog of tariffs and confusion and I suppose overall kind of hard to see where the future is going to go into a real positive there at the end. So Michael, thank you very much for your time. If it's okay with you, we might come back to you again when there's maybe less confusion. Maybe it's a 90-day kind of a podcast. We'll come back to you again to see how this might be shaken out and see what effects this might have for tillage farmers in the future. Again, thank you very much.
Perfect. You're very welcome.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Professor Wallace for joining me on the podcast. The Teagasc Spring Crop Walks continue today in Kerry and Kildare, and on Wednesday the 23rd in Louth, and next Thursday, April the 24th in Kildalton College. For further details of all of the events, go to teagasc.ie/events. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.